As I was sneaking up on the end of engineering school, I had to look for a job, and I didn't really want to be an engineer, although I had figured that out at the first week 4 years earlier. But you interview with the companies that come to campus, and who comes to campus at an engineering school but people that are looking for engineers. Luckily, some of them were looking for IT people, so I interviewed with a couple of those places, but then I ended up, one of the site visits I got to do after interviewing on campus was at an oil refinery. And I've never been close up to an oil refinery, but when you get close to it, it's mostly just a bunch of pipes. There's big pipes, there's little pipes, there's pipes going up, there's pipes going side to side. And the reason that you have a mechanical engineer there is because when you study mechanical engineering, one of the things you study is fluid dynamics, like how things flow through pipes of different sizes and what happens and all of the rest of that. One of the other things you study is heat transfer. So if you think about the radiator of your car, there's coolant that's in there moving around, and it's sucking heat off the engine, right? That's all the kind of stuff when you're talking about pipes. Now, I looked at all those pipes, including the ones that had, like, flames coming out of them, and said, is that okay? And they're like, yeah, it's totally fine. It's all within EPA limits. I was like, okay. And I pretty was well sure that I didn't want to be there. But when you look at all those pipes, there's gauges and there's shutoffs to keep stuff from, like if there's something breaks, you got to shut the pipe off so all the stuff doesn't spill out all over everywhere. I have long thought of human beings as sort of pipelines of God's grace. When we hear that Abraham was blessed to be a blessing, right? The blessing was not to stop at Abraham, but to flow through Abraham. So when we think about forgiveness, when we think about love, when we think about mercy, when we think about generosity, that comes to us from God and is meant to flow through us to other people. In today's gospel passage, we hear Peter come to Jesus after he's been talking about how to work out conflict in the church. And Peter says, well, how many times do I have to forgive? And I think Peter sat down and said, what's a really big number? And he said, 7, thinking Jesus would go, oh, no, like 3. But instead, Jesus says 77, and Jesus might as well have said what? 1,000, right? What Jesus is saying is, you don't get to shut the pipe off. Forgiveness comes to you. It's supposed to flow through you. Just let it keep going. Now, that is not an easy thing Jesus is asking us to do, because forgiveness is hard. Especially, and Peter's question is, if they're continuing to do the harm and continuing to be harmful in that relationship, continuing to forgive is a hard thing to do. And I don't think Jesus is excusing the harm. He's just saying, the way I'm inviting you to live into this is to continue to let this stuff flow through you. So then he tells a parable. Now, in the parable, there's a king that wants to settle accounts with his slaves, and so the first one comes and he's got this debt that sounds big, and then that one gets the debt forgiven, but doesn't forgive the debt of the person that owes them anything, and ends up then getting thrown into prison at the end. Anytime we talk about biblical money amounts, I like for us to kind of make a present-day comparison so that we can really understand what the gravity is of what's happening. So what I did, a denarius was 1 day's wage for a laborer. So the servant that won't forgive the debt of his fellow servant, it was 100 denarii. So if you say, let's say $12 an hour, if you work 8 hours a day over 100 days, if I did my math right, which is not always accurate, I think that's about $9,600. So that's the debt that he won't forgive. How big do you think the debt was that he was forgiven? Give me a number. Million? A talent was 15 years' wages for a laborer. 10,000 talents is 150,000 years of wages for a laborer. And again, if I did my math right, at $12 an hour, if you figure a full-time employee works 2,000 hours a year, that's $3.6 billion. So when Jesus tells this parable to Peter and the others, can you imagine one person a slave owing the king $3.6 billion? So when the slave goes, have mercy on me, I'll pay it back. Is that going to happen? No. So, right, the king said, okay, it's forgiven. And then he turns around and relative to that, it's not even a whole percent, right? It's a tiny, and he won't forgive that. So when I hear this story, I think, oh, well, the debt forgiveness flowed to him, the generosity flowed to him, the mercy flowed to him, and then he shut the pipe off. And almost every time I've read the story, what do I think about the guy in the parable? Jerk. What, you give it, right? You just look at what a terrible guy. He didn't let the thing go. And so the king turns around and says, yep, well, since you weren't merciful, then you don't get mercy either. Now, this week I ended up reading this story a little bit different, right? So I always just thought, he shuts the pipe off. He's not willing to forgive. When Jesus tells parables, they're not like factual stories. Like a lot of times Jesus is looking around and he goes, you see those sheep over there? And then he tells them a story. He's not looking over and going, you see Carl over there? He had this great debt forgiven and then he didn't. That's not what's happening. He's telling them a parable. But the thing about parables is they're true in the way that like poetry is true or like a novel is true. It speaks the truth about the human existence. So I'm guessing most of us know someone who has received some great gift of generosity, of forgiveness, of whatever, but then it stopped with them. It might even be that you gave something to someone and they weren't even grateful, right? That's the truth of this story, is that sometimes human beings receive gifts of generosity and forgiveness, and then, like, we shut the pipe off. But here's the thing about pipes. I'm going to switch to not a metal pipe, but your arteries. What happens if you eat too much stuff with high cholesterol? You get clogged. You didn't shut the pipe off. It starts to get buildup. And if it gets enough buildup and clogged all the way, you've got problems. But even if it's just a little buildup, is your heart has to work harder, right? So you are no longer functioning as designed. Your car. What happens if stuff gets built up in the little tubes and pipes in your car? It doesn't run great, right? Because those things are now, it's not working as efficiently as was designed. So now I think about the character in the parable, but more so about the people in our lives and say, what happens when our pipes get clogged? And that happens when we experience things in life. So some people grow up in a family where everything has strings attached, right? Anything, right? You do something and there's always an expectation, right? So imagine that the character in the parable, everything has always had strings attached. The king says, this is forgiven. Do you think it's forgiven? No, because there's always something coming, right? And so of course you're not going to want to go forgive the other person's debt because you don't know what's going to happen. Some people grow up and like my grandparents grew up in the Depression. You could not convince my grandma to spend money on anything, even if she had it, right? Because she grew up, right? She was so shaped by that and could still be generous, right? But that kind of thing can start to clog up the pipes to where whatever is really in front of you, that's not how you see it. And so if you think about just abuse that happens, just the bullying, the trauma, alcohol, all the kind of different things in life, those start to clog our pipes up because we did not experience the fullness of generosity, and then it's hard for us to have that flow fully through us because, right, it gets in the way. Now, the hard part about this parable is when you get to the end, because Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like, and then in the end, the one who didn't forgive gets thrown into jail and tortured, right? I don't think this is about like heaven and hell. I think it's about when the kingdom of heaven is present among us. And so I think what Jesus is saying is, if the love and grace, mercy, and forgiveness of God does not flow through you but stops with you, that is not a healthy way to live. And if you track in the parable, he has just been given freedom from an enormous, unthinkable debt. How would you think your emotions would be at that point? Joyful, grateful, happy. That's not where he is. He goes and starts to put his hands on the neck of another person, right? He doesn't have joy, even though he's just had this huge thing, right? Something is stopping up his heart in a way that he cannot live in the grace that was just given to him. He cannot live in the freedom of the forgiveness that was just given to him. I think what Jesus is saying is there's an enormous amount, $3.6 billion of grace dumped into you every day, And if you're stopped up, if your pipes are clogged, you're not going to live the fullness of the way God designed you to live. You're not going to live in a space where you have joy and peace and comfort, and you're not going to be able to share that with other people because your pipes are all clogged up. But this in particular is a story where Jesus is talking about forgiveness, right? And so it's easy to look at other people and go, what's going on with that guy? And if we just judge them, that's one thing. If we say, gosh, I wonder what's going on with them, what it is that's clogging up their pipes, and maybe I can empathize a little bit. And it doesn't excuse behavior, but it helps us to connect with the humanity of things and maybe move forward in a different way toward forgiveness. But the harder question is to turn on ourselves and say, what's clogging up my pipes? Why did I lash out at that person? Or why can't I respond as generously as I would like? What is it about my journey that has been difficult? And that's hard work to do. And often we don't want to do that work because it's scary to have to turn and think about and remember hard things that may have shaped the way we are in the world. But it's healing work when we can do it. Which brings me back to Peter. I wonder what Jesus, when he says, how many times should I forgive? I wonder, Jesus says we should love our neighbor as ourselves. I wonder what would have happened if Jesus said, well, Peter, what do you need to forgive yourself for? I have had so many conversations with people who can't even forgive themselves for all kinds of things. And if you can't forgive yourself, your pipes are clogged up, right? How are you going to forgive your neighbor how you love them as yourself if you can't love your own self? I have sat with people in their 90s who look at me and say, I don't think I've been a good enough person, which means that there is something about their life that they feel is unforgivable, and if they can't forgive themselves for it and can't believe God forgives them for it, how are they going to carry that forgiveness out into the world? And so there's ways that we can start to practice this. I had a guy once ask me, and I've probably told some of you this before, he said, Pastor, I'm going to read the Bible in a year. What do you think? I said, great idea. How about, though, you have to make sure you're okay if it takes 54 weeks instead of 52, or 18 months, or 2 years. At the end of it, you still would have read the whole Bible. But if you don't have a little bit of grace for yourself, what happens when you're sick for a couple days and don't read? And you come back the next day and go, gosh, now I got to read 5 chapters to stay caught up, right? And I had a similar conversation when I was a volunteer chaplain at the YMCA. I was talking to one of the personal trainers one day, and it was right after the New Year. So the gym is full of all people that made New Year's resolutions. And I said, when you're doing personal training with people, do you have a conversation about how they can have grace for themselves? Because if you start the new year and say, I'm going to work out every day, and then you have a long day at work, and you get home, and you're tired, you don't work out, you eat a big dinner, and then you go, oh, see, I knew I couldn't do it. And you can't have a little bit of grace for yourself, then you just give up, right? And you're back to, yeah. And if you can't forgive that, right? So those are simple examples. They get much more complicated when you talk about human beings, when you talk about the ways that we do harm to one another and the ways that we live with that guilt or with that shame. And so when Jesus says, forgive your neighbor 77 times, we probably should start with ourselves, right? And think hard about the things that are weighing on us and try to work towards forgiveness of that so that we can forgive the people around us. Now, when we come to these waters of baptism, we say that we die and are brought to new life, right? Jesus dies on the cross, come to new life. These waters take us on that journey while we are still here. The whole point of that is so that we can start over, so that when our pipes get clogged up, we can understand that they don't have to stay clogged up. Now, haven't ever tried this stuff. There's some stuff you can put in your gas tank that unclogs stuff. Does that stuff work? Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. And there's stuff you can pour down your drain if that's clogged, right? Grace and forgiveness and love and mercy from God, they're not just something that come to us and flow through us. It also cleans out the pipes, right? God's healing comes to us every day. Martin Luther talked about these waters of baptism and said, every day we start new. Every day. Every day we start with the pipes clean. Are they going to get clogged as we go? Yes. Can we love one another and forgive one another and try to love ourselves along the way? Yes. And when they get clogged up, Jesus will just keep cleaning them out and give us another chance to live into the way we were designed to be, which is to have clean pipes with grace and mercy flowing right through us out into the world every day. God will get us there, and we're going to probably try to shut the pipes off along the way, but God just keeps turning them back on. Amen.